The night cracked open with a laugh that cut like glass. The loading bay lights buzzed as rain stitched silver lines across the concrete. The narrator said, Ethan kept his head low, but pride held his spine. Lucas said, shine my shoes, street boy, or shine my car. Ethan said, I scrub floors, not souls. Murmurs rippled from the staff line as Grace watched, hands tight around a notepad. Maria stood at the shadow's edge, breathing quiet prayers into her palms. Lucas stepped closer, shoes spotless, heart colder. He said, poverty is a choice you keep making. Ethan said, cruelty is a choice you keep enjoying. The laugh faded, and thunder answered in his place. The narrator said, tonight would brand them all, because humiliation, once spoken, is a bell that never stops ringing. The narrator said, silence followed Ethan home like a stray dog that refused to leave. The apartment walls were thin, and the city hummed like a restless hive. Maria brewed tea that tasted like apology. Ethan said, he wants me smaller than my shadow. Maria said, you are taller than any building, even when you kneel. The kettle hissed like anger learning to whisper. Grace scrolled through notes, the words cutting her thumbs. She said, truth is heavy, but it travels. Rain tapped the window, writing messages no one could read. Ethan stood at the mirror and met the bruise hiding in his stare. The narrator said, some nights teach you the alphabet of pain, so you can spell yourself tomorrow. Morning dressed itself in glass and chrome as Lucas descended the marble stairs. The narrator said, wealth loves an audience more than a conscience. Victor watched from a balcony, rings bright as verdicts. Lucas said, invite the help to the foyer, I need an example. The staff gathered, hearts beating in their throats. Grace slipped inside, badge tucked, gaze steady. Ethan arrived with the delivery cart, shoulders squared. Lucas said, here arrives poverty, late as always. Ethan said, I arrive when the work begins. A chandelier chimed like laughter that forgot to be kind. The narrator said, shame performs best under perfect lighting, and he wasted yea. The narrator said, whispers are the currency of big houses. In the service corridor, words moved faster than footsteps. A maid murmured a name that tasted like a secret. Grace caught it, tucked it near her heart. Ethan said, what name did you hear? She said Noah, and it came with a door closing. Maria carried linens like offerings, eyes lowered. Victor's shadow passed, long as a corridor of winters. Lucas said, keep your heads down, and your dreams lower. The air chilled without touching skin. The narrator said, when a house buries truth, the floorboards learn to breathe. Evening returned with a mirror that refused to lie. The narrator said, reflection is a courtroom without lawyers. Ethan wiped the loading bay glass, seeing two faces superimposed. Lucas said, try not to smear what already looks cheap. Ethan said, glass only shows what stands before it. Rain held its breath, as if waiting for a verdict. Grace stood back, recording silence as evidence. Maria said, clean what you can, and let the rest stain the guilty. The neon flickered, a pulse in a wounded city. The narrator said, some truths arrive as outlines, and then they step forward with a name. The narrator said, dawn arrived dressed in pale gold, but Ethan's eyes carried the bruises of yesterday. He swept dust from the diner floor, every stroke echoing a quiet defiance. Maria poured coffee into chipped cups, steam lifting like fragile hope. Ethan said, work keeps me alive even when pride starves me. Maria said, pride is the only meal they can't steal. Grace entered, notebook tucked under her arm, watching Ethan's hands move like soldiers who had never known rest. She said, your story will cut through their silk curtains. The narrator said, in that cramped diner, love and resilience held court against hunger and humiliation, and dignity sat like a guest who refused to leave. The narrator said, at the mansion breakfast table, silver clashed against porcelain like swords drawn in velvet. Lucas leaned back, sipping orange juice, as if it were victory. Victor said, Respect is bought, not earned. Lucas said, I pay in humiliation. Servants moved like shadows, their silence thick. Grace stood at the doorway, pretending to be invisible. Ethan, carrying crates at the edge of the hall, heard the words bleed through. The narrator said, cruelty tastes sweet only to those who never swallow their own hunger. And Lucas dined on arrogance as if it were bread. The narrator said, Ethan's world shrank to the alley behind the hotel where boxes became burdens heavier than shame. His shirt clung to his back, sweat mingling with dust. He said, they think I break because they give me weight. But weight is how I grow strong. Maria brought him bread, wrapped in paper, her hands shaking. She said, eat not for strength but for tomorrow. Grace wrote every word into her notes, the pencil nearly tearing the page. The narrator said, between hunger and humiliation, Ethan forged armor invisible to all but those who loved him. The narrator said, in the mansion garden, roses grew fat with wealth, but their thorns whispered truth. Lucas walked with polished steps, tossing coins onto the gravel. He said, every man has a price, but some are worth less than dirt. Grace trailed behind, camera hidden, catching each cruel smile. Victor's voice cut across the hedge, weakness is disease, and poverty its symptom. Ethan stood outside the gate, mud on his boots, his stare meeting Lucas's through the iron bars. The narrator said, between the bars stood two worlds, one clothed in silk, the other in resolve. The narrator said, night returned with wounds that glowed brighter than stars. Ethan sat on the apartment floor, his back against peeling paint, staring at his calloused hands. Maria placed a blanket around his shoulders, whispering prayers only he could hear. Ethan said, I want to rise not to be seen but to stop bowing. Maria said, rise then, and let them choke on their own pride. Grace read aloud her notes, voice steady, the poor are not shadows, they are mirrors. The narrator said, and in that room, a fire kindled, one not of revenge, but of unbreakable will. The narrator said morning sharpened itself on the hotel lobby's marble, ready to cut whoever bled first. Lucas waved a security badge he didn't need, smiling like a locked door. He said, we lost a watch, and poverty always finds what is lost. Ethan said, I carry boxes, not trinkets. A guard opened his bag, and a glittering lie waited inside. Grace said, that tag is new, the clasp still stiff. Victor stepped from the elevator, silence bending around his authority. He said, guilt is loud even when it whispers. Maria reached for Ethan's sleeve and found only air. The narrator said, humiliation is theater built on a single prop. Ethan said, if theft is my price, you printed the bill. Lucas said, then pay in apologies. Grace said, or pay in truth if you can afford it. The lobby plants trembled in the air conditioning, like witnesses who wished they were blind. The narrator said, a signature can end a life without spilling a drop. The manager slid a paper across the desk, and the room smelled of lemon polish and surrender. Ethan said, if I sign, you keep the lie. If I refuse, you keep my job. Lucas lounged in the doorway, bored with the ease of victory. He said, dignity is expensive. You can't cover the tip. Grace said, I'll print the times, the camera angles, the missing minutes. Victor said, print what you like. Ink fades faster than money. Maria pressed her palm to her heart, steadying the storm. The narrator said, there are evictions that throw you into the street, and evictions that throw you out of yourself. Ethan lifted the pen, then set it down like a blade turned away. He said, I won't sign your story. The security guard cleared his throat and made the hallway longer than a mile. The narrator said, rejection lines the city like brick, and Ethan touched every wall. He asked at the dock and found doors learning to say no with a smile. Oman said, orders from above, your name raises trouble. Grace traced the rumor to a phone call that walked on Victor's voice. She said, power travels faster than the truth it outruns. Maria waited on a bench with bread that cooled in her bag. She said, Eat because hunger is louder than pride when the sun burns low. A worker whispered a name through the chain link, then vanished into steam. He said, Noah, ask the mirrors. The narrator said, a clue is a key that chooses its own lock. Ethan said, I'll ask every mirror until one speaks. The river slapped pilings like a patient clock counting down a secret. The narrator said, wealth throws parties to bless its reflection. Invitations flooded the city for a charity, gala draped in mercy and priced in cruelty. Lucas said, we'll honor merit provided it looks good in a tux. Victor said, control the room and the story kneels. Grace secured a caterer's wristband with a smile built for doors. She said, if truth can't buy a ticket, it will borrow the uniform. Ethan turned the band in his fingers, feeling the itch of risk. Maria said, stand near exits and carry your name like a candle. The floral vendor muttered about sealed rooms and mirrors covered in sheets. The narrator said, every celebration hides a funeral for a secret. Lucas rehearsed a speech about opportunity, while opportunity waited outside in wet shoes. The narrator said, rehearsal is cruelty without applause. In the side corridor, Lucas let a bottle tilt until red bled across the tile. He said, clean it, lesson in humility included. Ethan said, I clean floors, not people. Lucas stepped closer, whisper cold. He said, kneel, and maybe the story forgets you. Maria arrived with a towel and a stare that could stitch wounds. She said, stand up, or I will kneel and shame every king. Grace raised her phone, its lens a small rebellion. Victor appeared, voice like a padlock snapping shut. He said, distractions end now. The narrator said, some moments bend a spine forever. Others fuse it into iron. Ethan set the towel on the spill and refused the ground. The corridor held its breath and learned a new shape. The narrator said, the gala night dripped with chandeliers and secrets, each crystal catching lies in its cut. Lucas raised his glass, voice booming with pride. He said to family, the finest currency. Victor stood by, his silence heavier than gold. Grace whispered into her recorder, truth walks among them tonight, dressed in borrowed silk. Ethan carried trays, his shoulders rigid with every insult disguised as laughter. Maria stood near the curtain, eyes following her son's every step. Then a voice from the back sliced the room. Noah said to blood, the only currency you cannot fake. The narrator said, the air fractured, and every smile froze into stone. The narrator said, eyes snapped to the newcomer as though memory had dragged a ghost into the light. Lucas said, who dares interrupt? Noah stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. He said, the son you threw away. Victor's cane struck the marble, each tap a denial. He said, that name is buried. Maria's hand clutched her chest, breath thin with recognition. Grace wrote furiously, words barely keeping pace with truth. Ethan said, you wear my scars in your stare. The narrator said, secrets walked like living men, and shame grew a face they could no longer silence. The narrator said, Noah's words rang like broken glass in a cathedral. Noah said, your fortune bought walls but not silence. Lucas said, you're a fraud. Noah stepped closer, jaw carved from fury. He said, I am the mirror you fear most. Victor's voice cut sharp, silence this charade. Maria whispered, no, let him speak. Ethan's eyes locked on Noah's, seeing a brother carved by the same cruelty. Grace said, the story writes itself, history with witnesses. The narrator said, in that ballroom, truth became a guest no one invited, yet no one could dismiss. The narrator said, Victor's command fell heavy, but Noah's defiance carried thunder. Noah said, erase me, and you erase yourself. Lucas barked a laugh brittle as glass. He said, you think blood makes you worthy? Ethan stepped forward, voice steady. He said, blood makes you family. Choices make you human. Maria's tears cut lines through her tired face. She said, both my sons deserve breath under the same sky. Grace whispered into her mic, "The empire trembles at its own reflection." The narrator said, "The storm outside rattled windows, but the storm inside broke the chains of silence." The narrator said, "The room cracked open, truth refusing its coffin." Victor said, "Family is loyalty, not birth." Noah said, "Then loyalty died the day you abandoned me." Lucas sneered, but his hand trembled against his glass. Ethan said, "We are proof that your empire is built on sand." Maria said, "Secrets rot, and tonight the stench fills every corner." Grace said, "History bleeds into headlines." The narrator said, "The chandelier quivered as if afraid to fall, and every guest tasted the bitter wine of revelation." Noah said, "Look in the mirror, and tell me which son you truly see." The narrator said, "The ballroom fractured into a battlefield where words cut sharper than blades." Lucas shouted, "You are nothing but stains on my family name." Noah stepped forward, his fists trembling, but his voice unbroken. He said, "I am the name you buried but could never kill." Ethan said, "We are two sides of the same wound, and you cannot silence both." Victor raised his cane, his voice iron. He said, "This house belongs to me, and no bastard will undo it." Maria cried out, "A house that buries sons is already undone." Grace whispered, "Every lie is unraveling, and the world will know." The narrator said, "The chandelier flickered like a failing heart, and the truth drew blood from arrogance." The narrator said, "Accusations flew like daggers thrown in a dark room." Lucas sneered, "You both crawl in filth, pretending to be kin." Noah said, "Filth feeds roses that shame your marble floors." Ethan said, "Your wealth is walls, but truth breaks locks." Victor growled, "Bloodlines mean nothing without power." Maria's voice cracked, "Blood is power, but love is its throne." Grace said, "And love is what this empire never bought." The narrator said, every guest shifted, unsure whether to look away or stare into the fire. Noah pointed at Lucas and said, "Your mirror will curse you before I do." The narrator said, Victor advanced with the weight of authority, but the ground beneath him trembled with defiance. Victor said, "Silence them, or this family crumbles." Lucas echoed, "Then let it crumble, as long as I stand tallest." Noah spat, "Tallest towers fall the hardest." Ethan added, "And their bricks crush the guilty first." Maria stepped closer, eyes aflame. She said, "Your cruelty has no heirs, only graves." Grace whispered, "The world listens now, even if you do not." The narrator said, Victor's cane struck the marble, but instead of command, it sounded like surrender echoing hollow. The narrator said, "The storm outside rattled windows, but inside a greater storm broke free." Lucas lunged toward Ethan, his hand a claw of rage. Ethan caught his wrist, voice low and unshaken. He said, "You cannot own me, not tonight, not ever." Noah pushed forward, shoulder against Lucas, voice rawed. He said, "You will taste the pain you poured into us." Victor shouted, "Enough," but the word cracked like glass under strain. Maria screamed, "Stop this before the walls themselves fall." Grace's recorder captured every cry, the truth etched in sound. The narrator said, what began as whispers now roared, unstoppable, like thunder inside bone. The narrator said, the climax shattered the last veil between blood and truth. Lucas stumbled, his arrogance cracking into fear. Noah said, "You mock my hunger. Now choke on your pride." Ethan said, "Every insult you gave me becomes your reflection." Victor sagged against his cane, his empire crumbling in silence. Maria's tears burned, but her voice rose strong. She said, "My sons stand together, and no crown can break them." Grace whispered, "History crowns truth, not gold." The chandelier swayed violently as thunder roared. The narrator said, and in that instant, the house of arrogance fell to its knees. The narrator said, silence followed the storm, heavy with ash from broken pride. Guests fled the ballroom, whispers dragging behind them. Lucas sat slumped, his eyes no longer sharp but cracked mirrors of defeat. Noah said, You carved your throne from lies and tonight it splintered. Ethan stood steady, voice firm. He said, poverty is not shame, cruelty is. Victor leaned on his cane, his breath shallow like a man weighed down by ghosts. Maria said, I buried silence for years, but no more. Grace pressed her recorder, her voice soft. She said, history remembers nights like this. The narrator said, and the empire of arrogance collapsed not with fire, but with truth. The narrator said, outside, the storm washed pride into gutters. Rain hammered the cobblestones as Noah and Ethan walked shoulder to shoulder. Noah said, we were brothers long before truth spoke. Ethan said, then we will remain so after truth scars. Maria followed, clutching her shawl tight, her voice breaking but strong. She said, the world will hate your name, but love cannot be unlearned. Lucas stumbled into the night, his shoes splashing through mud once beneath him. He said, this city owes me reverence. Noah turned, voice sharp. He said, the city owes you nothing but memory of your cruelty. Grace whispered into her recorder, redemption limps but arrogance crawls. The narrator said, the rain baptized truth, even as pride drowned in its flood. The narrator said, morning revealed ruins not of stone, but of pride. Inside the mansion, Victor sat in his study, shadows stretching like regrets. He said, power slips when blood betrays. Noah entered, his voice unflinching. He said, blood does not betray, men do. Ethan stood beside him, eyes steady. He said, you built walls to keep us apart, but truth breaks walls faster than storms. Maria's hand touched the arm of Victor's chair. She said, your legacy is silence, and silence is a grave. Grace said, this house once ruled over many, but now it whispers only failure. The narrator said, even kings crumble when their crowns weigh heavier than their conscience. The narrator said, truth spread beyond walls, traveling on lips and ink. Grace sat in a cafe, her article alive with fire. She said, the forgotten brother has a name, and arrogance has a face. Ethan leaned across the table, voice quiet. He said, will they believe it? Grace said, they already do. The world loves to watch giants fall. Noah said, this is not revenge, it is balance. Maria whispered, balance is all I ever prayed for. The narrator said, and in the scent of coffee and ink, the storm became a story, and the story became survival. Outside, city bells rang like verdicts. The narrator said, evening returned with quiet, not earned but fought for. Ethan and Noah stood on the rooftop, the city stretching beneath them. Ethan said, we survived humiliation, and we carry scars as proof. Noah said, scars are not weakness, they are maps. Maria's voice drifted from the doorway, maps led to tomorrow. Lucas lingered below, staring up at the rooftop, his reflection broken in puddles. He said, the city forgets too quickly. Grace, standing beside Maria, said, the city forgets the proud, but remembers the fallen who stood again. The narrator said, and so the night closed not with victory, but with endurance lit by stars above wounded souls. The narrator said, morning rose like a bruise turning to light. Ethan and Noah crossed the alley with quiet steps that carried a nation of aches. Maria said, today we learn to live with the noise truth makes. Grace said, the city read every line and the silence cracked. Ethan said, I will work, not to prove worth, but to build tomorrow. Noah said, I will stand beside you until standing is easy. Lucas watched from a distance and tasted the dull iron of consequence. Victor stared at closed doors that no longer obeyed his name. The narrator said, what survives a storm is not innocence, but vow. The narrator said, Lucas found a mirror, and the mirror did not flinch. Lucas said, I wore a crown made of strangers' backs. He touched the glass as if it were a wound that finally spoke. Ethan said, the reflection is not a sentence, it is a map. Noah said, maps demand a road, not applause. Maria said, repentance grows where pride starves. Grace said, Confession is just ink until it changes the hand. Victor said, power is a habit I can no longer afford. The narrator said, and the mirror listened like a patient judge. The narrator said, consequences arrived without sirens, only paperwork and empty chairs. Victor signed documents that tasted like ash. He said, legacy is a word for stories people stop believing. Lucas said, what remains if the applause ends? Ethan said, hands remain, and work waits. Noah said, so does atonement, and it does not tip. Maria said, a family is a door you refuse to lock. Grace said, the city has a new appetite for truth. The narrator said, and rooms once ruled by fear learned the grammar of repair. The narrator said, Grace published, and the city answered with open eyes. Headlines marched like boots across digital streets. Ethan said, let the story feed those who were told to starve. Noah said, let it lift those who bend to survive. Lucas said, I will return what I took in pride. Maria said, then begin with apology that pays in deeds. Victor turned away from the cameras and toward a smaller light. The narrator said, justice did not sing. It breathed, slow and stubborn. The narrator said, night returned to the loading bay where the first wound bloomed. Ethan cleaned a pay until the city leaned in like a witness. Lucas said, I mocked your poverty and met my own. Noah said, mirrors do not lie, they only wait. Maria said, forgiveness is a door on a hinge of truth. Grace said, let this be the last note and the echo. Ethan said, we do not rise to be seen, we rise to stand. The narrator said, and the final image held two brothers in a mirror, and a world that finally looked back.